I am delighted to be with you this afternoon. I have a hard time imagining why anybody would take a beautiful Saturday afternoon in the fall and sit in a classroom and try and learn something about American history. But you did. You're here. We thank you. I'm going to push this button now. We're going to talk about pivotal points that destroyed American liberty, both yanked and gradual. About a year ago, a songwriter asked me to list what were the points that destroyed American liberty. But he wanted this list of pivotal points that destroyed liberty. So I spent an hour or two just typing them in, and we got 2 or 3 pages of single-space typing, one after another. These are the points I suggest you put into your song. Well, I thought, I'm going to give a lesson, and we're going to pick 3 of those out. 2 yanked and 1 gradual. Events that changed liberty and destroyed liberty in America. So there are many more. I've only picked 3, and one has got 12 points to it, but they're 2 yanked and 1 gradual. And let's see what they are. This is one of my heroes, J. Reuben Clark. In conference in October of 1941, he declared, "We are in the midst of the greatest exhibition of propaganda that the world has ever seen. Just do not believe all you read or hear. The elect are being deceived." Now, I believe that. I haven't always believed it because I didn't have an understanding as a youth, as a teenager and so on. That made no sense to me, but I now understand. I've got a good feeling for who the elect are. I consider him to be one of the elect. Okay, here's another quotation. This is from 1940, from J. Reuben Clark. "Abraham Lincoln stands as a man, the greatest of all, by the great force of his transcendent genius and with his Christ-like humility, compelled with the righteousness of his cause, Lincoln the peacemaker, the national savior." Now that's a kind of a summary of a long talk on the subject of Abraham Lincoln. And if you go to the biographies and to the BYU Law School and other places, you can see that he held Lincoln in the highest of esteem, next to Jesus Christ himself, as contributing goodness to mankind. Now, what did he say? The elect are being deceived. Now, the holy smokes, the evidence supports quite a different viewpoint than what he has expressed here. I wonder if he did any reading on the topic. And yet he's supposed to be one of the most profound scholars that came from Utah. He served as Undersecretary of State, Ambassador to Mexico. He had law offices in Washington, D.C. and New York and Salt Lake City, probably. He was a wonderful, great scholar. And yet, he said this. Now, 30 years ago, I wouldn't have known the difference. But somewhere about 5 years ago, actually it was in 2006, I became interested in knowing more about how liberty was destroyed. And I started to read. And that's where I told you I'd made an estimate just a few days ago. I had read 9,000 pages, more than 9,000, on the subject he's addressing here. I don't know which he read, which pages. 2 scholars out of those books I read pointed out that more than 50,000 books, not pages, more than 50,000 books have been written on this subject, Abraham Lincoln and his product and what he did for the country. So if there are more than 50,000 books available, you could read steady night and day for the rest of your life and you wouldn't even touch the pile. So which books you read determines what you think about a topic. It is important to decide what to read. After I finished a presentation in Idaho with some of the concepts I'm going to present now, this was about 2 years ago. I was speaking at the university in Idaho Falls, had a big crowd, about 200 people. It was a great event, 2 days, just like we're doing here. After I had presented, at the end of the 2nd day, a middle-aged man came up, and without comment, he handed me a speech. And the title of the speech was, "Abraham Lincoln, Man of God." No comment, he didn't say a thing, he just handed me the speech. Obviously, he was unhappy with what I had said, and he felt this would straighten me out. Well, here's another one of my heroes. I love the man. Wonderful things he's contributed. We'll speak about one of his books that he authored. It was a great book. In 1975, he wrote this book that would help us to celebrate the Declaration of Independence. A wonderful man. This was the title of his talk. And I read the talk thoughtfully and carefully. And again, like J. Reuben Clark, he praised the contributions made by this wonderful 16th president. Then I read my own magazine. I just did this about a month ago. As I was preparing this, I dug the magazine out again. I worked for my old hero, my beloved friend, my mentor. And I reread the article we published in 1987. It's ridiculous what we said. There's no basis in fact. It's just nonsense. But in 1987, when I was a staff member, I thought it was wonderful. Now, this is a great thing we're doing here. I remember when my dear friend, we'd go too fast ahead there, my dear friend there, Cleon Skousen, the editor, called me in the office, and he says, "Steve, I'd like you to write an article on Martin Luther King. Get it ready for the month when his birthday is." So I did my homework. I prepared the article. I typed it up, 3 pages, double-spaced, so it can go down into, 1.5 or so pages in the magazine. I submitted it to the editor, and he shook his head in disbelief. Now, he knew way more about that subject than I would ever know. He was one of the FBI agents that was tailing Martin Luther King. That's why he wanted me to do the research and put it in the magazine. He knew the guy was a less than desirable citizen. I said that well without using the G word. I've learned since the lunch break that we don't want to use the G word geek, because a computer geek is a good person, making life good and positive for us. Anyway, my dear friend says, "We can't print this. It's true, but we can't put it in our magazine." And so he edited the article down to where it was soft and gentle and kind. And I've always thought, why can't we just tell the truth? So nobody can fire me now. He could have fired me then, but he wouldn't let me have it in the magazine because he was the editor. But I was working for them, and I had to work within a framework. And now I'm independent. Nobody can fire me. All you can do is say boo and throw rotten eggs. So here comes. In this magazine that he edited, he did not write the article, but he did approve of this kind of material. Lincoln preserved the Union without violating the Constitution. Now, he said that 3 times. Again, he edited and approved of this statement 3 times in one article. It goes on. The Constitution successfully weathered its first major crisis thanks to Abraham Lincoln, who knew it, loved it, and defended it to his death. Is there any truth in that statement? See, most people have no idea. And when a credible source, he's one of the very elect. I believe that. So were these other 2 men that praised President Lincoln. But that isn't what the truth is. The truth is quite different. Why do you say that? Let's go to some primary sources. We'll take a look at what Lincoln actually did in his own words. "Read yourself full," this old man told me. This was great advice. "Read yourself full and speak from the overflow." Well, it was 30 years later I started reading on the topic that he had published in that 1987 magazine. Does that work out with arithmetic? 87, 97, 2007, not quite. So 20 years ago, I wouldn't have known the difference. 20 years later, 2006, I actually started reading, and then in the next 3 years or 4, I read over 9,000 pages on the topic from a variety of viewpoints with different perspectives coming in from different directions. Brigham Young said, "Abraham Lincoln was among the cursed scoundrels who have sought our destruction from the beginning. Lincoln was no friend of Christ. He, with many others, had assented to the deaths of innocent men, and through that he is subject to the influence of a wicked spirit." Well, that was quite different, wasn't it?
Where'd you get that?
Oh, that's what everybody wants. Where'd you get that? Where'd that come from? It's actually 2 quotations pulled together from a journal. I think I can give you the exact quotation after. If it's not, it's in my hide slide. That means I have to peek into my computer and see where I got it. Anyway, you can go to the website and read the article from whence this came, Googling up Abraham Lincoln and Brigham Young. I think you can go from there and you can find this website, but I can give you it exactly after the conference here. Anyway, this is quite a contrast. I only read that for the first time about 6 months ago. Holy smokes! These men are all from the very elect, and they totally disagree with each other. I mean, how can we have this? What's going on? So we have Abraham Lincoln saying, or we have Brigham Young saying that Abraham Lincoln is a scoundrel and he doesn't have the Spirit of God with him. And we have three good men saying just the opposite. And they all are what I believe we call in church, our church beliefs, they're all among the very elect. And so I had this personal conflict. What should I do with this information? I mean, I know that these men all put out these different statements. I don't doubt that. They said it. Is anybody telling the truth? I pursued it further. So I put the question mark here. Who is telling the truth? Is he a scoundrel or is he next to Christ? I thought about King Benjamin and his experience. Here's this great and beloved person. You remember the story, I hope you do, in your church history. He builds, have a tower built, and he stands on the tower, and he gives a talk. Now, when I was a Boy Scout, it was part of the MIA program to memorize a scripture every year, and I remember this scripture was part of what we memorized. And it was a beautiful thing, and I still can quote most of it today. And I thought about that. And here's what part of that scripture says. I am a mortal man. I am like as yourselves, subject to all manner of infirmities in body and mind. Well, that helped me a little bit. I have 4 mortal men, and they're all subject to infirmities in body and mind. That means they may have some areas where they don't understand fully what the truth is. I went to another scripture, Alma chapter 48. Moroni was a man of perfect understanding. If all men had been and were and ever would be like unto Moroni, behold, the very powers of hell would have been shaken forever. I love Moroni. I love the Book of Mormon. I enjoy learning from its precepts. And I read about Moroni and what a great hero he was, and then it came into my mind, see, I'm still pondering, how do I handle this when I've got these great men saying things that conflict? I thought, well, in Alma 60, Moroni accused Pehoran of being in a thoughtless stupor. He accused him of idleness, slothfulness, accused him of being a traitor and filled with iniquity. Well, do we hold General Moroni in less esteem because he didn't know the truth? Does that degrade him and put him in a lower category? No, he's still a great man. But he had an infirmity, he didn't know the truth, and he was willing to write a letter and state these things that were not true, accusing Pehoran of things that Pehoran had not done. Well, I thought further on the subject. God's elect servants do not know everything. Oh, could that be possible? I thought, well, you know, and I'm just sorting it out for myself, and this is the first time I have ever enunciated it in public. I thought, God's elect servants do not know everything. Alma chapter 7, verse 8, Alma says, I do not know. Now, we don't usually quote these kinds of scriptures, you know, we quote something else. I'm quoting a scripture, and he says, I do not know. But then in verse 40, in chapter 40, verse 9, he says, I do know. And then he explains what he does know. And then in verse 20, he says, I give it as my opinion. So sometimes he knows, sometimes he doesn't know, and sometimes it's just his opinion. I found that valuable to help me sort it out. This is another great hero. I love Mark E. Peterson. His newspaper editorials, his book here, they have value. The great prologue, written especially for the celebration of the bicentennial of the Declaration of Independence, the church encouraged every Latter-day Saint in America to read it. How many of you have read it? It was before your time. You weren't even born yet. Okay, in 1975, it was published. In 76, we had the bicentennial. The church created special lesson plans from this book with that as the front cover for Family Home Evening. Every Latter-day Saint family that was active was to have family home evening night several times on the Declaration of Independence and discuss the great prologue. It's a good book. It's worth reading. However, just take this sample right here, page 93. Thomas Jefferson, like Washington, had fought earnestly in the Constitutional Convention for freedom of religion. Does anyone have any problem with that? Now, I read it again, and I read before it, and I read after it. I read the whole page over again. There is nothing on the page that will lead you to any conclusion except that Thomas Jefferson, like George Washington, had fought earnestly in the Constitutional Convention for freedom of religion. Somebody in this audience tell me what you think about that. Oh, please. Where was Thomas Jefferson? France. He was in France. Now I thought, if Mark E. Peterson really means that at the Constitutional Convention, then he made an error. If he meant something else, he should have explained it. Forgive me, but he made an error, it appears to me. Well, Mark E. Peterson on page 48 said, some historians say that. And then he went ahead and made an explanation. I thought, well, he should have said that in front of every paragraph. Every paragraph in the book is the product of what some historians said, and he read it, and he put it down in his book. That's how they create books. It's like an apothecary. In the old days, the apothecary was the druggist, and he would go to the shelf filled with bottles of liquid, and he would pick a little liquid here and a little liquid there, and he'd pour it into a new container and stir it up, and here's a new remedy. That's how books are written. They go to the library or the computer, and they pull a little out here and a little out there, and pretty soon they put it all together, and this is a new publication, a new book. But what if some of the material he read was tainted? Then the book's going to have tainted portions in it. Well, I'm glad he said that, because I'm going to use that now. Everything I say, I should preface with the remark, some historians said that. And then you can know that it might or might not be true, because not all historians know the truth. How did this elect man come to his opinion? How did he do it?
Experience.
Yeah, he was there. He didn't read a book. He watched what happened. He was a contemporary with the President of the United States that was violating his rights. And he observed, and he said, the man is a scoundrel. And other things that were not the nicest possible things to say. He never called him a geek, however. How did these elect come to their opinions? Reading books. Dr. Skousen said to me, read yourself full and speak from the overflow. Never did he know that I would read 9,000 pages on a subject and disagree with him. They read books and they reported the truth. That's all I can conclude as to why they would come up with those conclusions they came up with. Some historians say that what President Mark E. Peterson said would be an appropriate start for each of them as they wrote their essays and their books and their opinions. This is what we have read, and some historians say that happened. This is a book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. This is not by some wacko. This is a history professor at Harvard University. His name is James Lowen, PhD in history. Some historians say that, and he read 12 history books. This is a picture of him at work. He read 12 history books. He has 10 of them piled up here. He weighed each one because they were so gigantic and thick. In fact, they were high school history books, 12 of them. He weighed them. He counted how many pages they had. One of them I read. American History. What a unique title. American History. 1,077 pages, and it weighs 5.3 pounds. There was no lack of space to put in whatever they wanted. And so if there was something they left out that would have made this paragraph more meaningful, they could have put it in had they wanted to. Blackout, it's called in writing history. You just leave it out. Just don't tell them the whole story. And then you can draw different conclusions. Well, I just really enjoyed James Lowen James Lowen had done this research. He spent 2 years at it, undoubtedly paid a very good salary, working at the Smithsonian Institute. He finished his project and he published his, 500-page book report on these 12 books. This is his book report. Lies my teacher told me. Because he goes through the 12 books and he shows the contradictions. And shows that they can't both be true because they contradict completely and totally the other book. That's his effort here. You can see the big grin on his face. I'd have been happy too. This would be an interesting experience. I recommend that history teachers use 2 textbooks so that students may realize the contradictions and ask questions. I don't think 2's enough. My personal belief is you're going to have to read more than 2. I have read at least 30 on the topic I'm speaking of now and find numerous agreements and numerous contradictions. So then we're confronted with the task, how do we sort it out? He goes on to say, old myths never die. They just become embedded in the textbooks. Some historians say that. Now, I'm prefacing the rest of my remarks, all of my remarks today and last night, with this statement. I don't know for sure what the truth is, but some historians, and by the way, what is a historian? He has been educated for the ministry of teaching and writing history. And whatever his preference is, he may write in his own bias into his preferred material. Some historians say that. Now, I'm going to give you 3 points today that were pivotal points to take us away from liberty. I'm going to give one that you've never heard before. This will be new stuff. This man right here in the year 2005, just before 2005, he's a specialist, he's a lawyer in Indian affairs. I thought of picking this great big 3 pages of possibilities for today's lesson. I thought I'm going to pick this one because this audience will never have heard this before. His name is Lindsay Robertson. He's researching in an Eastern library, and he comes across a reference in the library that says that in that library is a trunk full of original papers, this is what we call original documents, by the Supreme Court in 1823. Now, who was the Hamiltonian nationalist that I discredited in an earlier lesson? John Marshall. In 1823, John Marshall made a decision, and he wrote the majority viewpoint for the Supreme Court. The original documents were all available, it said, in that library. Well, he went up to the front desk. Now, this is happening this is just a couple of years ago. He went up to the front desk and all excited, and this is original source material I'm about to lay my hands on, a whole suitcase full of it. And he said to the librarian, where would this be found? Oh, she says, I'll look. She looks and she says, oh, the owner came and got it. Where does he live? England. Did he actually come and get it himself? No, it says here his son actually picked it up. Where does he live? Oh, next door. So I don't know his next door exactly, but it was not very far away. So one thing leads to the next, and he's immediately over there. And the son is a craftsman, as I recall, a carpenter type woodworker. And he had no interest at all in his father's collection of papers from the original court case of 1823. None interest, none. But he said, the case is downstairs. I've never gone through it. I don't even know what's in it. A trunk filled with original documents on the court case of 1823. Primary source material. So Lindsay Robertson goes down the basement with this man's blessing. He completely spends days and days reading and preparing and writing this book. Conquest by Law. How the discovery of America dispossessed indigenous peoples of their lands. Who are the indigenous people? The American Indians. And by law, we dispossessed them of their lands. We stole it, with other words. We cheated them. That's what his book's about. Who are these people? What's this? This is the ocean. This is the bay. These are the English discoverers coming in to discover this new land. Who are these people? Well, they just happen to be the ones that live there, and the land belongs to them. Or does it? Oh, no, it doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the discoverers. Who owns the land? This is the question that Lindsay Robertson was trying to discover. Well, when the Christian discoverers got upon the shore, they made declarations like this: in the name of our sovereign king, we claim ownership of this land that we discovered. What do you think now? I biased you enough. I put the twist on this. I've spun it enough. Did these people really own the land? They just landed there. They'd never seen it before. This is our land. We discovered it. Oh, Lindsay Robertson, he didn't go along with that. It was great reading. But what about the Native Americans that had lived here for centuries? Didn't they have any ownership rights? John Marshall, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, consolidationist, Hamiltonian nationalist, in the case of Johnson versus McIntosh. Now you can Google it and you can read it. Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823. Now this is the summary of that court case, coming from Robertson's book. John Marshall was guided by his own self-interest. With other words, selfishness was the reason he was making this decision. Oh, it seems that Mr. Marshall had friends that owned vast acreages of land, and it would be to their interest if they ruled this case a certain direction. Oh, so he ruled for his own self-interest. Marshall made a tragic mistake. He invented the Discovery Doctrine. Now that's the name that they're using still today. Political catastrophe for Native Americans. That means a terrible pivotal point in destroying their liberty. And it was the Discovery Doctrine of 1823. It contributed to the evolution of judicial lawmaking. Intelligent people can sometimes unthinkingly create catastrophic problems they find themselves powerless to fix. Know any intelligent people like that? How about yourself? Have you ever caused a problem and later you weren't able to fix it? I've been in that dilemma more than once. I wished I hadn't never done it, but I did. The Discovery Doctrine of 1823, boiled down, I'm quoting right out of his book, upon discovery of the continent, European sovereigns acquired title to all discovered lands, while indigenous peoples retained only an occupancy right that could be transferred only to the same discovering sovereigns. This is the court case. That's what they decided. All to the benefit of white men and to the encroachment upon the Indians, to the detriment of the Indians' liberty. This act of 1823, this court case, resulted in the Congress, the United States Congress. And by the way, last night you asked how long have we been hanging these on the wall. I don't know what year this picture was taken, but you can see the fasces on both sides of the speaker stand. In 1830, they passed the Indian Removal Act. Well, since the Indians don't remove the land, then we will remove the Indians by whatever force is necessary. And so they did. And an artist trying to capture on canvas this horrible situation shows the Indians being removed. Now this particular piece of artwork is called the Trail of Tears. And you can see the soldiers are here being sure the Indians leave. They did not provide them with adequate anything. They left in the middle of the winter. Terrible times. Thousands of them died before they were removed far, far off to some desolate place in Oklahoma, some spot like that, other places. This was not the only Trail of Tears. Now, by the way, I have an entire lesson, and you ought to hear it sometime. It's called The Rise to Empire. This is a tiny segment out of that lesson. The rise to empire was underway. Do we want to be an empire? Why don't we put that in the Pledge of Allegiance? And to the empire! It's because we don't want to be one. We're supposed to be a freedom-loving country with liberty. But we were rising to become a domestic and then an international empire, which is where we are today. In 1838, the Trail of Tears was one of many trails of tears. There were many others, and overseen by this big, fat, pompous Uncle Sam. That's what was going on. That's the truth. Here's an example of another trail of tears at a different time. It seems that the Indians often made treaties with the federal government, and the treaties were often broken by the federal government. And the federal government put this particular group of Sioux Indians onto a small piece of ground called a reservation, and they promised they would give them gold or give them money and food. They didn't. So the Indians are confined to this small piece of real estate. They have nothing to eat, and they're not supposed to leave this geographical boundary, and they're starving to death. What are they to do? Well, they did what probably you and I would do. They got up and left, and they were angry when they left. They were tired, emaciated, starving, and angry. And when they came to some white settlement, they tried to beat them up. It's called on the warpath in white language. Were they justified? Well, I'm not sure they were justified in beating them up, but they were justified in trying to find some food. White men hadn't kept their word, and the Indians were suffering terribly, a loss of liberty. Well, this man was sent to quell the Indian uprising. His name was General John Pope, one of the generals in the Civil War. He said, "It is my purpose to utterly exterminate the Sioux. They are to be treated as maniacs or wild beasts, and by no means as people with whom treaties or compromises can be made." Who was the one that violated the treaty? Was it the Indians first, or was it the white man first? It was the white men in this case. They hadn't provided the food. They hadn't provided the money. And what food they did provide after the dishonest people in the transaction got their share was rotten food. Oh, they gave them some food, but it was not palatable. This is a part of our story. When was liberty destroyed in America? It was destroyed one small piece at a time. This is one of the pieces. That's not the end of the story. So General Pope went in. He beat up with his well-fed army, well-fed, well-armed. He went in, beat up, and captured a few hundred of these Indians. They had a short trial. That means you get 5 minutes on the witness stand and you're sentenced to death. Next customer, next Indian, and they kept, sentencing them to death. Finally, they boiled it down to just a mere 38 were going to be sentenced to death. And they sent a letter to the President of the United States, or telegraph, or however they communicated, and he wrote back officially, ordered that the 38 Indians and half-breeds sentenced to be hanged by the military commission be done on Friday the 26th of December, 1862. Now these men were marched 12 miles from the prison through the snow at 20 below zero to go to the hanging stand. This is the illustration. I say, you can Google this all. I get it all on the internet. You Google it up. There's the picture of it right there. These are the military. It said there were 2,000 of them watching as they hanged 38 Indians in one simultaneous stroke of the axe. Chopped the rope, 38 dropped to their deaths. What's this doing? What's going on here? Well, this all goes back to the decision by the Supreme Court. Who owns the land? This is an interesting part of destruction of liberty. By the way, who are the people all around there? These are all the citizens. They called it a vengeance hanging. We're angry at these Indians, and so we're going to come here and we're going to be happy to see them all die. Big show. Carrie and Mary Dan, skipping ahead now to the year 2008. I checked carefully on this. This is a video that came out in 2008 called American Outrage. It happened in Ruby Valley, Nevada, and I just happened to have good friends out there. So I called two ranchers and pieced the story together from their firsthand experience. Carrie and Mary Dan live out there in Nevada. They are two Indian sisters. One of them not too long ago was killed in a ranch accident, so one of them is still alive. And they tell their story in this DVD. And the two ranchers that I know, one of them said, "You've got to call this other man." I called one of the Indian ranchers, and I had a wonderful visit for about an hour. I thought I was talking to a Philadelphia lawyer. He was so well versed in the legal rights of the people in his area. In 1853, a treaty was made with the Indians in Ruby Valley. They were the Shoshone Indians. I've been to Ruby Valley many times. I love the ranches out there. Worked for the ranchers for summers and winter, just a great place. Ruby Valley was huge. You can see it takes this massive area of Nevada. A treaty of friendship was signed with the Indians there. See, the Indians were few and far between. They didn't have much land that they actually had to live on. They ran their livestock on vast expanses of range. A treaty was signed in 1853, a treaty of friendship to share the land. Now, that was nice of them since it just happened to be theirs when we got there. And so they signed a treaty of friendship. This is the photograph of the treaty, Ruby Valley, Nevada. Today, the court case started several years ago, but in our recent times, these two Indian sisters, here's one of them with one of their attorneys, Julie Fishel. The attorney's trying to tell this Indian what she found out. And she says to the Indian, a federal agency of the Department of Interior announced to me that the Treaty of Ruby Valley had been abrogated by the Western Lands Commission. Well, what does that mean? That means the Western Lands Commission just said the treaty's null and void. No meaning to it anymore. With other words, we'll just violate it and it won't matter. This is an Indian specialist in law, Tim Coulter, attorney with the Indian Resource Center. He said to the Indian women, I was informed that the Shoshone lost their land by gradual encroachment. U.S. law says that the Indians are in a state of permanent involuntary trusteeship with no opportunity to ever change it. Gradual encroachment? Permanent involuntary trusteeship? Now this is current. I'm talking about today. This is the situation today in our time, coming from the 1823 court case. So on September 2002, the federal government decided to confiscate the livestock that the Indians owned because they were overgrazing the range. The Indians just had too many livestock in the opinion of the Bureau of Land Management, and they must remove some of this livestock. So they started in with helicopters. The DVD shows the Indians were there with their cameras taking pictures of all this. And it shows the helicopters coming in, swooping down on the herds of cattle and horses, driving them through the barbed wire fences, running, like crashing into the fences, keep going, cutting them all up. And they confiscated large numbers, hundreds of head. These are the, I was going to say the military, this is the BLM fully dressed with their tasers, what else do they use nowadays? Semi-automatic weapons, what is the other one? Mace, whatever they have hanging on their belts. These are the policemen that will not allow the Indians to do anything to stop the confiscation. One Indian tried to light himself on fire and they wouldn't even allow that. They put him out with a fire extinguisher. He poured gasoline on himself and says, I quit, lit a match. And they shot him with a fire extinguisher and wrapped him up and took him to jail. Can't allow that. This is a pen of livestock, one of many. Hundreds were removed. Now, I'm just giving you one example of a pivotal point in American history where liberty was attacked and destroyed, and a people that we generally pay no attention to. The range leased for gold mining immediately after the Indians got all their livestock taken off for overgrazing the range, and one historian says that it looks like this today. That's a photograph off across this range where they had overgrazed. Well, what is that? It's an open pit gold mine. You see, the grazing of livestock wasn't nearly as beneficial as gold mining for the federal government. Eric Shavitz, professor of federal Indian law, explained it like this. The Discovery Doctrine declares that the Christian discoverers own the land. The doctrine is still applied today. Now, this is a current lawyer of Indian affairs. I added this like November the 1st. I just barely read the article, November the 1st. It came out on the 10th Amendment Center website. Rob Nadelson is a fine scholar. I've talked to him at length. Don't agree with all of his material, but he does a good job of research. How Congress took control of Indians' lives. And they're just, what day is the day? The 5th? 4 days ago, he writes this excellent article well-researched material, how Congress took control of Indian lives. Just as Congress has stretched its interstate commerce power into authority over the entire national economy, so it has used the Indian Commerce Clause to justify micromanaging the lives of American Indians and of their tribes. It wasn't supposed to be that way. Good article. 10th Amendment Center. I like the 10th Amendment Center. I keep reading their material. Choices have consequences. As I sat by my father, not far from here in an Orem Rehabilitation Center, his hand was laying out on the arm of the chair. It was 6 weeks after he had made a poor choice. His poor choice was to make a Christmas present without using push sticks on the table saw. Okay, and his hand was laying there, and I said, "Dad, tell me about your accident." "Son, this was no accident. This was a bad choice." And he went in to explain. I love my dad. He's my greatest hero of all the people I've ever known. And he made it clear that wasn't an accident. That was a bad choice. When I got home and I told my little grandson, 6-year-old at that time, I said, "Grandpa cut his hand off. Terrible, terrible. Cut his finger off and his thumb off. And he did it in the table saw." My 6-year-old grandson, who watches me every day, comes out faithfully to the shop, and we cut wood on the saw almost every day. His first statement was, at age 6, to me, "Grandpa, why didn't he use push sticks?" That was a bad choice. My dad is a good man. He is one of the elect, and he made a bad choice and nearly lost his life. He nearly bled to death, had several other problems, but 6 weeks later it appeared he was going to make it through. Good men can make bad choices. I don't judge the character of these men because I can't. I think God has to do that. This man made some bad choices. Now there are thousands of books to read, and this is one of them. Written in 2010, as I recall, this guy's a Utah citizen from Salt Lake City, Ron Anderson, Abraham Lincoln, God's Humble Instrument. Now that would go right hand in hand with the Constitution magazine's article on Abraham Lincoln that Cleon Skousen approved. It would go perfect hand in hand with that. It would fit perfectly with J. Reuben Clark and Mark E. Peterson as they expressed their feelings about this President of the United States. That's the class the book is in. One of more than 50,000 books. I chose it. One of my friends asked me, "Tell me what you think about this book." Okay. Most people, we're quoting from the book, page 364. Most people who study the life of Abraham Lincoln cannot help but conclude that among mortals, few ever came closer to Jesus' height of moral perfection than did Abraham Lincoln, God's humble servant or humble instrument. Well, okay, that was the author's opinion after probably reading, oh yeah, he has a bibliography, a great big long bibliography, dozens of books that he's examined, and he comes up then with this is his concluding statement. I'm glad he put most in there. I'm not sure that's even correct, but at least some people who study the life of Lincoln come to this conclusion. What did you study? What books of the 50,000 did you read? I think I found out by just overall review that many of those, probably far in the majority, are in praise of what he did. And you would have to search to find one that gave a different viewpoint. I managed to read some of both kinds. This is a book that I felt was a scholar doing his homework and trying to report the truth. Not trying to color it one way or the other. He just said, this is what I found, and this is why I put it in my book, and this is where it was located. And he goes back like the apothecary, and he takes a little from here and there, and he writes a new book. The year is 2006, and the scholar's name is William Marvel, and he just happens to be an award-winning scholar on this topic. In other words, he has written several works on Abraham Lincoln's life. This is just one of them. In there he writes, Lincoln's belligerent course promised no better result than maintaining the territorial integrity of the United States at the expense of weakening the Constitution, and with no initial hint of eliminating slavery. Now, there's a whole bunch in that sentence right there. So we're going to maintain the geographical boundary, and we're not trying to eliminate slavery, and we're weakening the Constitution. This is William Marvel's opinion of what he's trying to teach us. In his mission to preserve the nation's geographical boundaries, Lincoln quickly violated his oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Now, this is a direct contradiction to the previous book and the previous articles, contradicting hundreds of other articles that say he did follow the Constitution. Who's telling the truth? Now, quoting still from William Marvel's book, Lincoln, and I just take a few of the excerpts out that give phrases of his feeling, Lincoln's unconstitutional decrees, basic illegality of his actions, curtailment of constitutional rights, arrogated authority, a nationalist hero, a tyrant who trampled on the Constitution, unconstitutional excesses, often acted unconstitutionally, Lincoln's war on state sovereignty. Now, that's not a complete list. I just give you a sample of what this author brings out in his book as he is explaining that period of history. William Marvel, a historian, says, now we don't know if it's true or false, but he's trying to put the documentation down in a way that you can find it credible. So we have these two completely contradictory treatises of the life of an icon, a great hero in America. Is either of them anywhere close to the truth? Before Lincoln became president, now, if you want to learn about the Bible, what's the best book to read? The Bible. If you want to learn about some famous person, what might be something good to read? What they said, without editorializing, not from some secondary source where they took it out of context. Read the entire speech, read the entire letter. So I thought, I think I better do that. I found this book that did a good job of collecting the political thought of Abraham Lincoln, a highly credible historian. He did no editorializing. All he did was publish the Gettysburg Address and the various speeches and letters that Abraham Lincoln. We could then get a summary of what he believed. A summary meaning it's only 330 pages. Now, to get all of Lincoln's writings and statements would require a lot more pages. I read 330 pages of a good cross-section of his beliefs, different periods of his life. Before he was president, he said things quite contradictory to what he did as president. Lincoln, before the war, reverenced the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. And he gets quoted frequently by great people, by prominent elect, about what he said when he was young. Obey the laws of the land. Okay, we got to follow the laws of the land. What's the supreme law of the land? Oh, come on, a little more emphatic. What's the supreme? The Constitution. So he's saying we should obey the Constitution. Obey the supreme law of the land. Support Whig Republican platform. Now, protective tariffs, national bank, government subsidized internal improvements. He was all for that, and he made it clear in his early life. Leave slavery to be decided by individual states. The federal government had no authority to interfere with slavery. He made that clear in his early, in fact, he made it clear in his first inaugural address, and made it also clear in his early remarks that blacks were inferior to whites. They weren't equal. Later on, he would make this emphatic declaration that all men are created equal. Well, which time was he telling the truth? Any people, anywhere, have the sacred right to secede from existing government. My, oh my, that was interesting. He was there at a convention where the keynote speaker was a communist socialist who had fled from the 1848 revolutions, and he was here in America trying to raise funds so he could go back and have another revolution. And Lincoln spoke at the same platform with him, fully in support of the revolutions that were going on, because he said any people, anywhere, have the sacred right to secede from the existing government. Really? What did he say 12 years later? Just the opposite. President Lincoln's choices. Now he's president. Let's take a look at what he did. Fernando Wood, honorable mayor of New York City from 1860 to 62. This is a colorful character. Google him up. You know, but he was a background like you can't believe. But he was the mayor of New York City in those years. I like the photography here. He declared, Lincoln is an unscrupulous chief magistrate whose recent message to Congress was an ocean of falsehood and deceit. Really? Lincoln's message to Congress was an ocean of... This man must be a political... he must hate Lincoln for some reason. He was a Democrat. This guy right here, he was a Democrat. He was a copperhead. That means he was really bad. Those are names that they tagged on those people that didn't support the Union approach to solving problems. So he says that his recent address to Congress was an ocean of falsehood and deceit. Now, I had already read the recent address to Congress months before I ever heard of Fernando Wood. And I thought, well, that's interesting. That's at least another witness that the message to Congress wasn't a very good message. I went back and reread it and found the message to be exactly what Fernando Wood said it was. A message of falsehood and deceit. Have you ever read the July 4th speech to Congress in 1861? Anybody in here ever read the speech? No, nobody ever read the speech. You need to read the speech. Instead of hearing what I say about the speech, or some other historian says about the speech, read the speech. And it won't do you much good unless you're planning to read more. It's like I was in 1960, what is that year? 1987, when we published that magazine article. I thought it was wonderful. I didn't have anything on which to base my choice and decision. But now I do. I read the speech. Going back to this book, which publishes the entire speech, the message to Special Session of Congress, July the 4th, 1861. I can't stop to give you all the details. It takes too long. But I'm going to encourage you to do your own homework. In that speech, I show you, this is the page out of the book. This is how I read a book. I learned this from Cleone Skousen. I sat there beside him in his basement study in the furnace room. That's where he used to have a book library. And we studied together. He taught me how to read and study and think. It was a great, great mentor. And he had a little fine point, a big ballpoint pen with a very fine point. And he would write copious, meticulous notes in the margins. His books would be filled with marginal notes. This is my book. Filled with marginal notes. I cross-reference to other books. Why I think this statement ought to be compared with another book statement. They don't agree. I cross-reference them so that later I can go back and reduces the reading time. I can see the page, read my notes, and know where to go. This is utter nonsense, I wrote right here. See it? This is utter nonsense. That was after I had something to make a judgment with. I couldn't have written that in 1987. I had nothing, no standard, no way to judge. But now I know it's utter nonsense. This map of the North and the South, we see in blue the northern states, the South in gray, and the border states, they call them in red. Okay, before the North could conquer the South, first they had to conquer the North. The first victory of war between the sovereign states was the conquest of the North. Let's take a look at that concept. There were numerous steps to subjugate the North. I'm going to list about 20 of them here. And this is not an exhaustive and complete list. These were the steps that were necessary, the North felt were necessary to subjugate the North. Attack freedom of the press. Now, about 4 years ago, a book came out on this topic called Lincoln's Wrath, all about how the freedom of the press was destroyed by the Lincoln administration. Now, we use his name, Lincoln. It's the Republican Party. It's the Republicans and their effort to squash the South that we're referring to. They just happened to have a chief administrator named Abraham Lincoln. So one of their goals was to attack the freedom of the press. Now, we're not talking about in the South. We're talking about in the North. Any newspaper found guilty of any disloyal statement would be subject to all sorts of evil things. In the early days, they first would they would arrest the editor and put him in prison without charges and hold him indefinitely with no trial. They would often have a mob come in and wreck the newspaper, destroy the office. You ever heard about a newspaper that got wrecked in, Missouri? They threw the type out the window and the press in the street. I built one of those. In fact, I built 6 of them. That's my business, building printing presses and old things. And we built 6 presses. W.W. Phelps, do you remember that name in the history of your church? W.W. Phelps and the printing press. And what were they printing? Oh, that was evil stuff called the Book of Commandments. Yeah, the First Doctrine and Covenants. It's not new to have a printing press ruined. So here they were ruining the printing presses, and what was their crime? Disloyalty. They had expressed some opinion that was not in harmony with the Union opinion. Use federal troops to interfere with elections. They did that several times. Disrupt the U.S. mail delivery. Censor all telegraph communications. Deport an opposition member of Congress. A congressman dared to stand in the halls of Congress and explain that he didn't support the Union effort to squash the South. So they arrested him and had him deported. Threw him out of the country. His name was Vallandigham. Demand compulsory draft, or $300. If you had $300, you could buy your way out of being in the draft. You didn't have to go to war. And this caused the people of New York a great amount of stress. And so they rose up in righteous indignation and had what they call a riot. And so they brought in a huge army of federal troops to squelch the riot and make them conform to this draft technology or technique. Create 3 illegal states, nationalize money, nationalize the railroads, appoint Red 48ers to high positions in the military. The Union Army was made up of 23% Germans. Nothing wrong with Germans other than the fact they had just fled from the Socialist Communist Revolution and were here trying to continue their program. And appoint many to high positions of leadership that had just come from the Socialist Communist Revolution. Establish a progressive income tax, completely in violation of the Constitution. Ignore Supreme Court decisions. Usurp executive power and run roughshod over the North. Each of these is worth at least an hour's presentation. Seize control of the legislature of the sovereign state of Maryland. It seemed that Maryland was a border state and they were considering whether they should join with the secession movement. But not allowing them to make the consideration, the federal government went in and arrested their delegates, locked them up, and had others appointed that would be in harmony with the northern position. So interfering with the state of Maryland, refused to engage in peaceful deliberation with Southern leaders to solve problems confronting the Union. There were a number of very prominent men from the South who pled for an audience with this administration. Would you please listen to our grievances? No, wouldn't hear them, wouldn't hear a word of it. Turned them away. Used secrecy and deception to encourage the South to fire on Fort Sumter. My, oh my, really? Authorized purchase of supplies and planned a military invasion of the South without the consent of Congress. Doesn't the Constitution require Congress declare war? Doesn't it require that Congress determine how much money will be spent on what projects? All of that was bypassed. Micromanaged the war effort. Now this is important because when he micromanaged, he knew everything that was going on. He was there working with the generals, deciding what strategy to use next, telling them what he thought they ought to do. One of the things he told them was, repeatedly, they used a strategy of attempting to crush dissenters with overwhelming military might. Now Grant was famous for this, Ulysses Grant. The South would be well dug in, fortified on their own home ground, and Grant would order 20,000 troops to charge into their cannons and their guns, and they would just mow them down. And he knew that that would happen. He was ordered working with the president on this strategy of war. They completely, they did away with all of the international rules of proper warfare. And then he said in his second inaugural address, as this was in full swing, with malice toward none, this is God's punishment of these people. Who was punishing them? At any moment he could have raised his hand and said, stop. Stop this horrible killing of teenage boys. Let's talk about this. He never would. It was God's punishment. Abandoned the international law and waged war on civilians, and the estimates are 50,000 civilians died because of this abandonment of international law. Spearheaded a quest for empire as a primary goal of government in America, crushing states' rights and focusing all power in the central government, similar to what was happening in Europe. Whew. Now, it's just a partial list. Smile, somebody. Break into a little bit of it. Well, not that bad, was it? We're still here. We haven't lost everything. Benjamin Curtis was a peer. He was there watching. Benjamin Curtis, Justice of the Supreme Court for 6 years. He resigned from the court just prior to this this war between the states. And now he's watching as a bystander as all of this goes on. And it's 1862, and now he's watched for 2 years what's taking place. You need to know who this man is. Now, his book is on the back table. I want no copies left when I leave. It's just a little thing, just a pamphlet. It's only about 30 pages. He was a member of the Whig Party, and the Whig Party became what? Republican. He was, with other words, a Republican. Later in life, he felt it was best to be a Supreme Court justice and not be a member of a party, and so he said then, I withdraw from being a member of a party. But his early life, he was a Republican, a Whig. He was born in Massachusetts with a nationalist perspective. He believed in a powerful central government. He believed in nationalism. And that helps to, and he's born in Massachusetts. He's a dyed-in-the-wool northerner. 6 years service as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, one of the most respected jurists and lawyers of the period. Now, this is Justice Benjamin Curtis speaking. The book doesn't have this cover now. This is the cover it came out with when it was reprinted about a year ago. It's got a different cover. It's back on the table. It's called Executive Power by Benjamin Robin Curtis, published in 1862. As Commander-in-Chief, we're quoting from his book on page 5, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy in time of war, I have a right to take any measure which may best subdue the enemy. Is that true? Does the President, has he been authorized with war powers to do anything he wants to subdue the enemy? He can take him to Guantanamo Bay and torture him, or send him off to Syria to be tortured instead of here. Can he do that? Not legally, not constitutionally. There are distinct limitations even during war. For example, the President's war powers during wartime do not allow him to abolish trials. The Fifth and Sixth Amendments limit even the prosecution of war decision-making by the President, as these categorical guarantees contain no exceptions for wartime. As amendments to the President's powers under Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, they must amend, which means change, and in this case limit, the President's war powers, or the entire purpose of amending the Constitution is pointless. So amendments 5 and 6 have no reference to wartime or peacetime. They simply require what? Due process of law by a jury of your peers and various other things that are required. Did the President of the United States honor that? No, not at all. Benjamin Robin Curtis does a wonderful job in short, concise legal language that you can understand it still. In writing this essay, short essay, like I say, it's only about 30 pages, he tells the story of executive power being usurped by that administration. Probably does as good a job as anything I've read on the topic. This is a summary, a one-sentence summary of that essay. I wrote the summary. The Lincoln administration has ceased to be a government of a constitutional law and has become a government of usurped executive power. Right. Now, this is a direct quotation from his book. This is his, Justice Curtis's example. Oh, this is not a direct quotation, it's only partially, it's out of another source. He writes his wife. He gets done writing this book, this booklet, this essay, and then he writes a letter to his wife. And he says, "Dearly beloved, I expect to be imprisoned for this report. However, I ought to do what I can to subdue the enemy at home. If I do not return, look for me at the prison." He fully expected to be arrested for defying the administration by writing a book telling the truth about their violation of the Constitution. The enemy at home? That is a direct quote. Who did he mean? Who was he referring to? Remember when a person takes the oath of office nowadays, some people say with their right hand up, "Against all enemies, foreign and domestic." He's referring to the domestic enemies, the enemies at home. The Republican administration that was running roughshod over the Constitution and violating it daily. That's the enemy he referred to. A putsch. Now we got a little vocabulary lesson in here. Once in a while we have to try a new word. I don't know these words. There'll be lots of big words I come across when I read, and I don't know what they mean. I have to look them up. So putsch was one of them. I didn't even know how to say it. I looked at the word putsch and I thought it was pooch. But I told you last night that I have an English professor that likes to correct me. So I got grievous figured out and heinous, and now I have to say putsch instead of pooch. So it's putsch. Definitions, one English professor says it's putsch. Unconstitutional overturning of a government. A sudden decisive change of government illegally. Now this is what a putsch is. An unconstitutional overturning of a government. A sudden decisive change of government illegally. Now, putschist. So if you believe in an unconstitutional overturning of the government, you are a putschist. Now, Google this. It's worth reading. The Lincoln Putsch. America's Bolshevik Revolution by George McDaniel. Recently new essay. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was made possible by communists and socialists. That's a quote from this essay, and then he goes on to elaborate. This is nothing new. I read 2 entire books that cover the subject in detail. Here we have just got this little essay of 20 pages or so. Lincoln Putsch. That's all you probably have to Google and you'll get it. The proclamation of September 24th, 1862. Now this is what we call evidence. We're looking at evidence. This is the proclamation, quoting directly from it. First, all persons guilty of any disloyal practice against the authority of the United States shall be subject to martial law and liable to trial and punishment by court-martial. What's that mean? Well, the federal government, namely and specifically the executive department, namely and specifically the Secretary of State and the United States President, wrote this. They just passed a law bypassing Congress, and the law is a disloyalty law. If you are guilty of any disloyal practice, well, what does that mean? Am I disloyal because I'm standing here today saying that my federal government is violating the Constitution? Am I disloyal?
Yes.
Yes. And I would be subject to imprisonment without trial, without even charges. They wouldn't need them. And it would be a court-martial. It would not go through the courts of the land. It would go through the military. And the military might, just like they did the Indians, just wave me by and say, guilty, next. Second, that the writ of habeas corpus is suspended in respect to all persons arrested or who are now imprisoned in any place of confinement by any military authority. What's that? Does the president have the right to suspend habeas corpus? Habeas corpus was the wonderful, wonderful thing that had been preserved for hundreds of years, going back into early England with King John and the Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights, and the Magna Carta. These were times when habeas corpus came into being, and the people said, you can't throw a person in prison and leave them there indefinitely. They have a right to have a hearing before a judge to see if there are sufficient reasons to hold them. Oh no, Lincoln says with his administration, we will suspend that. They have no right. We will arrest them if they're guilty of disloyalty, and we'll throw them in prison as long as we want, without a trial and without any charges. My oh my. Does this sound like the America you were taught about in high school? No. No, they taught you a different version completely. Who was it that said that history was one of the best ways to destroy liberty? Which long-haired geek did we have on the screen? Karl Marx. Karl Marx. September the 26th, and by the way, the signatures, Abraham Lincoln and William Seward, Secretary of State. They signed this into law without going to Congress. September 26, only 2 days later, it will be the duty of the special provost marshal to arrest all disloyal persons, subject to arrest under the order of the War Department. So now under the War Department, anybody that, what's disloyal mean? What's the definition? It's whatever they want it to mean. It's anything you say that they might decide is One example was 2 men were in a bar drinking, and they were saying things that were not respectful to what the Union Army was about to do in the South. And they were arrested because they were disloyal. That's how easy it was to be disloyal. By order of the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and L. Thomas, the Adjutant General, a continuation of the usurpation of power. By proclamation, the Republican administration announced their unconstitutional overturning of the government. Now, what's the new word for that? Putsch. A putsch had just taken place. Okay, the putschists were in action. Their proclamation was a sudden, decisive change of government illegally. In other words, a putsch. Now, here are some putschists. This is the noun I learned about. Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, and Charles A. Dana, Assistant Secretary of War. Charles A. Dana is a unique person because he was the first communist to take a position of high leadership in our government. Now, have you ever heard of McCarthy? Joseph McCarthy? What was he accused of? Why, he said there was a communist under every bed. You've heard that phrase, haven't you? Well, he was wrong. And he was vindicated. Because he was wrong, they found out in 1995, see, sometimes the truth takes a while to surface. In 1995, who do you think helped us to find out McCarthy was telling the truth? Well, it was that guy with the mark on his head that was the premier of the Soviet Union. Wasn't his name Mikhail something? Yeah, Mikhail Gorbachev. In 1995, he allowed the volumes of material in the Soviet Union to be opened up because of perestroika. And he said, and glasnost. And he says, now you can come examine and learn for yourselves. And so some historians say that they read from these manuals from the Soviet Union and found that there were hundreds of communists in the federal government during the McCarthy years. How many did McCarthy say there were? I think he had less than 80. And now we know he was wrong. There was not one communist under every bed. There were 3. This is history. I mean, we can find out things today that we didn't know 20 years ago. Once in a while, something new comes up. In the year 2000, Robert Stinnett published a book, and he documented, well done, he documented that the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, it is beyond questionable doubt, they knew that Japan was about to blow up Pearl Harbor. And now we know that there's enough evidence, documented evidence, and you can read it and see it in Robert Stinnett's book of 2000. But as far as I know, that's the first time we ever saw good evidence in print. Before it was just hearsay. And now, I told my dad this one day, I said, Dad, Roosevelt, along with others, it appears without any doubt, knew that the Japanese were about to destroy Pearl Harbor. And he sat there kind of somber, and he thought for a minute, and he said, that makes him a murderer, doesn't it? Does it? If you know that your soldiers are about to be slaughtered and you don't do anything about it, it's a pretty grim crime. I got off subject slightly. Charles Dana was a communist. Here are more of these putschists. Salmon P. Chase, Secretary of Treasury. William Seward had a little bell. I don't know if it's real or figurative speaking. He said, I can ring my little bell and have anybody in the country arrested anytime I want. And he exercised that power of pointing out people he wanted arrested that might be disloyal. Putschist. Here's some more putschist. General George Cadwalder. He refused to carry out the orders of the Supreme Court Justice when he was ordered to bring a certain person out and let him come to court and see if he had charges sufficient to hold him. He refused to do that. Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune, he was a devout supporter of Karl Marx and printed many essays from Karl Marx. These are putschists. They wanted to overthrow the concepts of constitutional government. General John Fremont, well, he ran for president on the Republican ticket in 1856. He was surrounded, it says, some historians say. Fremont's staff was literally crawling with red 48ers. Now, remember Karl Marx? He wanted national sovereignty, working men of all countries unite. In 1848, there was a revolution. The Communist Revolution was trying to overthrow the existing government, overthrow the Christian religion, and replace it with a great society. This is a review of what we've talked about earlier. Times 18 other countries engaged in the same thing at the same time. Where did they go? Many of their leadership fled to America. They became known as the Red 48ers. The Red 48ers became Republicans. They joined and started the Republican Party. The Red 48ers can be read about in detail in this historical book. And this one, here some of them are. Major General Carl Schurz, Major General Franz Sigel. Now these are these communist socialists that were appointed to high leadership positions. They were over, 10,000 troops or some such number as they directed the Union Army into this conflict to suppress the South. These are Red 48ers, and they're putschist. More Red 48ers, more putschist. More Red 48ers, more putschist. These are all appointments by the Republican administration to lead in the Union Army. More Red 48ers, more putschist. These are founders and starters of the Republican Party. These revolutionary promoters of the socialist communist agenda in Germany brought their ideas of social democracy to the United States. For more information, Google. It's good reading. Google the 150th anniversary of Lincoln election. Probably that's all you'll need, by Murrah, M-U-R-R-A-H. Good reading. Just a short essay that he tries to bring this together. Dwyer, John Dwyer, in his book about 7 years ago, his book is titled The War Between the States, America's Uncivil War. That's a good descriptive title. He says, let me liken the Communist Manifesto, over here, to the goals of the Republican Party following the war. Radical Reconstruction goals. And he takes each point of the Communist Manifesto. I don't expect you to be able to read those. I'm simply pointing out that this author, this historian, took the trouble to show how this Communist Manifesto goal was implemented in Reconstruction after the Civil War. Interesting reading that you don't just find in any of the local high school textbooks. The War Between the States, America's Uncivil War by John Dwyer. Very worthwhile reading. 609 pages, published in 2005. Note, with this putsch, we were no longer a voluntary union of free, sovereign, independent states by the consent of the governed. November the 19th, 1863, the 16th President of the United States delivered the preamble to the new constitutional order. Now, what could that be? The preamble to the new constitutional order was the Gettysburg Address, according to this professor. Columbia law professor George Fletcher wrote this book, Our Secret Constitution, How Lincoln Redefined American Democracy, and he said it was wonderful what happened. And the preamble to the new constitutional order was the Gettysburg Address. And he just gushes about how great that was. I really enjoyed reading this book. It was a very thought-provoking and enjoyable read. A good scholar who believed what happened was wonderful. This is a one-page book report. No, this is a direct quotation from page 2. This is a direct quote. The Civil War called forth a new constitutional order. The principles of this new legal regime are so radically different from our original Constitution, drafted in 1787, that they deserve to be recognized as a second American Constitution. You see, a putsch had taken place. our original Constitution had been replaced, according to George Fletcher, law professor at Columbia University Law School. I never heard that in high school. In sections 1 and 5 of the 14th Amendment passed in 1868, it completely, well, I would do better if I read my own writing here. In sections 1 and 5 of the 14th Amendment, which was illegally foisted upon the states July the 9th, 1868, the federal government was made superior to the states. This was part of this Reconstruction movement. And today we hear the 14th Amendment quoted all the time by the Darwinian Supreme Court. As they say, oh, well, the 14th Amendment provides us to do this and to do that. That's the justification they put for the Roe versus Wade case, to kill the babies, was the 14th Amendment. Was that amendment really any value? Foisted upon us? Where did I get that language? From the Utah Supreme Court in 1968 in the case of Diet versus Turner. Google it and read it. Diet versus Turner, Utah Supreme Court. They said that the 14th Amendment was foisted upon us illegally. Our Supreme Court in Utah, you mean they're a bunch of wackos? They would say a thing like that? Yeah, our Supreme Court in Utah, they identified correctly that we were cheated in the 14th Amendment. Yankee Leviathan is the front cover of a book. Excellent reading. The Origins of Central Authority in America, 1859 to 1877. Richard Benzel, Cambridge University, 1990. Good reading. Yankee Leviathan. What's a Yankee? A Northerner. What's a Leviathan? A giant, or a monster. So we have the Northern Monster is the title of the book. And then he goes ahead and elaborates. The modern American state emerged from the wreckage of the Civil War. The secession of the South and the decision of the North to attempt military reunification produced an explosive expansion of central state authority. Human events. Charles Adams. This is excellent reading. This is a 2000 book. During the war between the states, a new nation was brought forth with an all-powerful federal government, obliterating the sovereignty of the states. Lincoln's war to preserve the Union turned out to be a war that destroyed it. Here's a picture in 1864 called a political caricature, published in England. Because had you published this in the United States, you would have been arrested and your press destroyed, and you would have gone to prison because you were disloyal. But they published this viewpoint in England. What are they burning up here to create this new government? It says the United States Constitution, freedom of the press, states' rights, habeas corpus, other things. We're destroying those things, and from that arises this monstrous thing called the Federal Phoenix, and the head on top. Whose head is this? President Lincoln. This is a political caricature. Maybe the authors don't know what they're talking about. This is how they viewed it in England. And I put these words on: a new nation is rising from the destruction of these elements down here. This is one I got out of the magazine like yesterday, the day before yesterday. Yeah, it was the day before yesterday. I thought, I'm going to add this slide. This is a current political caricature. I'm sorry all the magazines are gone from the table. They've already been picked up that I took it out of. The magazine is the Freeman. It shows the Civil War, seeds of Leviathan. Now, what's this word Leviathan mean? Giant, monster. So the Civil War, the seeds of Leviathan, and if you could see his hand, he's casting the seeds out, seeding the United States with seeds of a monster. This is the political caricature. Who would publish a thing like that about a great icon? Who would do a thing like that? The name of the article is America's Turning Point, page 8. There's another article, the whole magazine, and this is, I'll show you the cover in a moment. The whole magazine is on this theme: gaining a nation, losing a republic. Now, what were we originally? A republic of republics, and we gained a nation and we lost our republic, according to this author. Who would say a thing like that? This came out in the April issue in 2011 of this magazine. Now, I wished everyone in here says, oh, we read that already, Mr. Pratt. Can't we go on? Have you ever heard of the Freeman magazine from the Foundation for Economic Education? Please, somebody say yes.
Yes.
Good. Do you read it? Once in a while. Once every 20 years. Yeah. Okay, so 1 or 2 people have heard of it. Now, this magazine is a credible magazine, been around a long time. They just felt that it was worthwhile in April of 2011 to try and tell the story that I have been telling you today. And so they published 4 or 5 articles on it, and it's good, straightforward, good material, well done, boiled down into, you can read it in, say, 10 pages instead of 9,000. J. Reuben Clark, who's that guy? Who? Ernest L. Wilkinson. Thank you. I'm so glad someone recognized him. I love Ernest L. Wilkinson. He was president of BYU when I went to BYU. We held him in highest respect. Who's this guy? What do they got to do with this magazine? Well, they served on the board of directors for 31 years. Well, that's interesting. Each one taking a turn of about 10 years. Their total service was 31 years. But they're all dead now and the magazine's changed hands. Can't be a credible magazine anymore, right? All I'm trying to point out is these men at that time served for 31 years on a magazine they held in high respect. It still maintains the same fine standard of scholarship. You can go to that magazine, probably read it online, and read these essays. 31 years of support of the Freeman. Who was the closest to the truth? I'm afraid to say that I'd have to vote with Brigham Young. Now, I don't know if he was really a scoundrel, the President of the United States, but he definitely was making bad choices that interfered with the liberty and the lives and prosperity of the people. Question marks there. Who was the closest to the truth? Now, we've been going on a long time, and this lesson's really dragging on and on and on. I was afraid some of you might, commit some horrible act. I don't know what it would be, but let's take a few moments of rest. I didn't have any idea how long this would take. I've never given this message before. I've spilled out to you my internal feelings. Let's rest for 10 minutes and then we'll spill the rest, if anybody's willing to listen.